Hey guys, Dr. Mike Israel here for Renaissance Plus and RPU, lecture number 8 in arguing to convince. A long form of argument, particularly for internet discussion and forum discussion, is argument egress. The subtitle here is Leaving a Discussion with Care. So egress is a very fancy, super smarty art term for leaving, right? But it's leaving. I always think of egress as like one of these, like you don't just turn around and leave. You leave looking at your surroundings. Like when the military, when they say egress from an area, it means, keep your sights up and move away as opposed to just turning around and running away. So egress is like a strategic leaving, which is a very perfect term here because there is strategy to leaving, to making sure that the argument that we were having, the discussion that was having, is most productive. We're going to talk about a couple things here. Not a super long lecture, but some really, really good stuff. Why does egress style matter? Number one, why are we even talking about this? Why don't we just cut the discussion short? We're going to talk about allowing for multiple discussion cycles, kind of not leaving too soon. We're going to talk about how to determine the egress decision. Basically, how do you know when it's time to cut it off? And we're going to talk about dealing with belligerence, which is a super common topic we've been talking about a lot, but this way in the sense of how to deal with it, and maybe if it's so bad it causes you to leave, or you're dealing with it while you're leaving, and some final tips and kind of words of advice on intelligent egress. So here's the deal. Why does egress style matter? Why can't we just be like, hey, all right, see you later, or just not reply and the argument's over? As a matter of fact, on Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that, a lot of forums, that's how egress occurs. Someone puts some data that the other person can't argue against, or doesn't feel like arguing, or gets bored, and they just don't reply, right? Or they'll say something like TLDR, haha, which is probably about the stupidest thing you could ever say if you're trying to convince anyone. TLDR is just like inadmissible in court, right? So a lot of times people don't do this, but it's a fault, right? Egress matters. Why does it matter? There's a couple of reasons. Here's the deal. A lot of people will not be convinced on the spot. Ego is a really big deal. And even if you did convince them on the spot, they might not want to admit it. And sometimes you didn't convince them on the spot, but you got them thinking. I've left arguments. Very recently, actually. Every other couple of days, I have discussions or re-discussions which make me really think and change my mind. But if you ask me right then and there, I'd be like, so what do you think? I'm not going to admit that I've changed my mind because I have an ego too. I'm going to be like, I've still given it some thought. I'm not sure. Days later, weeks later, maybe months later, maybe a couple of incidents led up to this, I'm actually going to change my mind. And it turned out that the way that person that I last talked with left the argument has a pretty big decision on if I'm going to change my mind or not. We're going to talk about that right now. So here's the deal. If you were very unpleasant at the end of the discussion, at the end of the argument, the person who may have been considering some of your views are going to be super unlikely to consider it later. Right? They're going to be like, well, that person's stupid and I hate them and there's no way I'm giving their argument second thought. That's not the way you want to leave, right? On the other hand, if you were open and kind, maybe they were giving your point some serious thought. And if you were really diligent and really super awesome to the end and you egress properly, they might give your points some thought later. And in addition to that, so you may have convinced them later, and they have the benefit of saving face. They never ever had to admit or it be clear to people in a public forum that they were convinced of something because, geez, that's kind of rough. It's kind of tough to be like, well, I was wrong, you were right. So they save face. They don't have to change anything on the spot. But on the other hand, they actually did change their mind. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. Egress is a big deal to that. If you just leave in a really dickish way or just cut them short, you're not letting the seeds of potential convincing be watered properly for the days and weeks and months later in which they're going to think about it on their own time. Second point, a lot of argument and a lot of convincing is actually for onlookers, especially on social media. If you're discussing something, and especially if there's a lot of people reading the thread, like if, let's say, you are talking about like artificial sweeteners on the thread of, some super holistic health quack who has 1 million Facebook followers, and someone's like, yep, this is totally true. And you're like, actually, what did you guys think of this? And blah, blah, blah. You have this discussion. It's very productive. You don't convince the main person or people you are arguing against. But what ends up happening is people read your discussion later that are just, a lot of people that click on these health gurus, they're not like super anti-artificial sweetener or something, or not super naturalistic. Sometimes they just don't know any better. Like a lot of people think Dr. Oz is like a really good source of information, even though he's not. Still click and that'll come up, or they're your friends, they're your acquaintances, however the Facebook algorithm works. They'll read the stuff, they'll go through the debate, and they'll go, wow, like this person really, and they even left the argument in a great way, because a lot of times the thread will end, right? And it'll like the last thing you see, or the first thing you see when you click on the thread is the last part of the thread. And they read your comment like, hey, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me. I really wish you the best. You're like, wow, this person seems super nice. That's really rare online. And they read more of your arguments. It turns out, man, you had a lot of really great points. Now they're convinced, or now they're giving it some thought. So you may not have convinced the one person you were debating, and then have convinced 10 or 20 or 50 or more other onlookers. That's a really, really big deal. That's a huge deal. You just did way more good than you could convincing one person. So remember, when you're arguing in an open forum, usually most arguments nowadays aren't just you and a friend or an acquaintance in a living room or something and no one else hears anything. A lot of times you do have discussions with a lot of other individuals around to read it. And even if it's not even then, or to listen to it or read it then, it's later because all the stuff is archived. So it's really, really good to be able to have good egress to paint a good picture for everybody else, not just the person that you're talking to, right? If onlookers saw you as a warm and reasonable person, she's much more likely to consider your points. Egress to convince that person, to make them more likely to talk to you later, to convince them of other things or learn from them more, or to convince third parties that are looking at it, which is really common. Egress matters a ton, right? But before we need to get to egress, we need to talk about discussion cycles, right? You don't have to egress right after the discussion basically fails or comes to a full agreement with just one hashing out, right? Basically, if you fail to come to terms through one cycle of discussion, all the stuff we just talked about, with examining disagreement and reducing logical disparities and going to the data, if it was just one cycle of that, you might not convince everyone or just leave it on a note. There just may be a lot up in the air that you may still be talking after one cycle. You might have to do another round of, okay, let's reestablish what we know. Let's reestablish what we're agreeing on. Here's the contentious points. Let's dive into them, all that kind of stuff. You might have to do a couple of cycles or mini cycles towards the tail end of that kind of stuff. And here's the deal. If you have the time, it's totally cool to pursue multiple cycles of data and logic presentation and discussion. That's totally fine. You can't just expect every argument to end after one cycle, right? You might leave an argument after just one cycle before convincing someone, right? So you went through 3 cycles or just one, and then it would just take one more cycle of argumentation to convince that person. And all of a sudden you just left too soon. It was kind of stupid, right? Sometimes you read arguments and a person starts to present a really good view and the other person counters and the other person just doesn't even say anything after that, or goes, hey, I don't have time for this. It was really great talking. You're like, man, I really wish that person would have stayed around, as I really feel like they had this thing nailed down. So sometimes it really is a good idea, if you really want to convince, to be open-minded to the idea of speaking for quite some time, right? If you do convince the person, you want to thank them a ton. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for chatting with me. And you want to wish them all the best. And to be honest, your attitude there can turn an honest loser into a major ally. I've personally done this numerous times because I've had these people message me later, right? I've actually hashed out with people, convinced them of something, and they were like, shit, I guess I was wrong. Guess you were right. And I'm like, hey, thanks for so much for taking the time to chat with me. I learned a ton, and seriously, kudos. It was great. And then later, because they can't hate you, they can think about it, and they come back and they had some arguments where they used your own arguments against other people, and they come back and go, hey man, like, I don't know if you remember this, but 6 months ago we hashed some stuff out, and I just thought the way that you handle yourself was awesome, and you really did have a point. I've been reading up on this so much. By the way, I found these other articles you might find interesting because you didn't mention them back then, but they support your point even better. And I've been talking to my family about this stuff. I really am passionate about this issue, and I just think well, you're really doing a good thing, and I thank God that I talked to you about it because I was so close-minded before. That absolutely happens, right? It all comes down to the kind of attitude you egress with. But you can't convince everyone. So egressing after convincing is as easy as saying, hey, thanks so much for your time. This is really good. Kudos. And then you're out. Egressing without convincing gets a little bit more complicated. So if we haven't convinced someone, we have to determine our egress decision, right? How do you do that? There are 4 factors in which we determine egress decision. The first one is timing. Like, you might not just have to leave for, a couple of minutes, And you can say, hey, can you hold on a sec? Or you could just be like, hey, I gotta go. Maybe we should take this up later. Or you might have to leave for a vacation that lasts a week. And then you can just can the whole discussion and be like, hey, it was a great time. So you can pause an argument all the way up to delaying an argument and all the way up to just canning the whole thing altogether because you're like, look, we're never going to pick this up ever again, right? So it could be a timing situation. Like if you've got a meeting in 5 minutes and you're balls deep in a Facebook discussion, you're like, you can't keep going. So you got to be like, hey, let me get back to you in a bit, or be like, hey, it was a really great time talking. Like, let's say you don't feel like, for other reasons that we're going to mention, it's not going anywhere and timing is a constraint, you could just can it then. Another one is commitment, right? If you and or the other party really care about the issues and the outcome, you can delay egress and continue to hash things out, even if it takes multiple days of online discussion or something like that. So for example, let's say you have found, let's say you're talking, you happen to be liberal and the person you're talking to happens to be a conservative, and you both agreed that liberals and conservatives are just talking past each other, and it happens way too often. And there's got to be a way to have people be able to talk to each other and be more rational and reasonable and come to understandings to communicate so that we can have a properly functioning democracy. You're both passionate about that. And you both just found each other online, and you're both passionate, and then you disagree on the details of your views. You really want to make sure that we find a way to communicate. But you have different ideas about how it's best to promote that kind of communication. So what you're debating is, how do we best promote communication between people at different political lines? Because you're both super passionate about the issue of communication, you may be like, hey, let's really hash this out. Let's talk about this. This is super interesting. And they go, totally agreed. I don't know if you're right about this, but let's figure it out. Let's talk to each other so we can really, really, really get to the bottom of how to communicate best. That's totally cool if you're super passionate. If you're not super passionate about it, someone's like, hey, what color bike should I get? And you're like, I think you should get a green one. They're like, nah, green sucks. Blue is better. You might be like, all right, sweet. And then you're not super committed. And you're like, oh, well, sweet. Thanks for asking me. And best of luck with whatever bike you choose, right? So commitment, if the person's really committed, if you're really committed, you may choose not to egress and delay that decision. The degree of agreement can play in, especially with in relation to timing, right? So if you're close to agreeing, you might try to stick around for a little bit, like you almost got it. But if you're really far off, maybe leaving's okay, So if you, have another hour left over of discussion, and you also want to get some other things done, and you're really close to agreeing, because like they start saying things like, I kind of see where you're coming from, and you just have to supply a little bit more data and you're good, it might be worth it. But if the person's like, I absolutely, you're totally wrong on everything, and you've been talking already for like 30 minutes, and you got just 30 minutes left, you're like, yeah, especially, if the degree of agreement has so many potential jumps that, they say something like, well, I really do think that capitalism is absolutely the best way to run the global economy, and you're a diehard socialist, like you think the very structure of the economy needs to be different. If you're trying to convince someone of socialism, and you got half an hour, right? The degree of agreement currently is 0. It's just not something you're going to be able to do. There's a combination of timing and degree of agreement there, right? Where you're so far apart on issues, like we're just not going to, I'm not going to teach you Marxist economics in 30 minutes. It's not going to happen, right? So you might just be like, oh, thank you for your time. I really maybe implore you to read the following things if you'd like. If not, no big deal. So lastly, this is a really, really big one. This is one that's not so much known right offhand. It's kind of something you find out as you talk to people. It's their attitude / your ratio of work versus progress, right? So if you've been discussing with people and even tiny and obvious points are being contested, or you've put in tons of time and there's been basically no progress, you might want to consider egress sooner. It's just that simple, right? So like if you're talking to, what's a good thing? Like you're talking about weight loss to someone and they're like, so what do you mean by calorie? And you're like, come on, it's got like the definition, it's super obvious, right? It's just pure science. And they're like, well, I don't know. I don't really want to know what you think because I don't agree with that. That person's just not interested in agreeing on anything, right? Or if you're talking about global politics and they were like, well, Vietnam technically wasn't a war, it was just a conflict because war was never declared, blah, blah, blah. It's one of those things where it's like, man, yeah, you're right technically, but we're just, we're talking about Vietnam being a good versus bad idea. It's kind of tangential, and it's this tiny little point that say, you claim that the war in Vietnam was unjust, and their retort was, well, it wasn't technically a war, it was just a conflict. Like, boy, that's going to be, especially if you've been hashing us out for 30 minutes and that's as far as you got. It's probably just, you might want to consider egress, depending on how much commitment you have, time, and degree of agreement, etc. So that may lead you to figure out not sometimes if you want to leave the argument, and once you've decided if you want to leave, when you want to leave the argument, after how much due diligence, at what point. Second to last, you want to deal with belligerence. You're going to want to know how to deal with belligerence. What does belligerence mean? It means just someone having an attitude, a really big attitude. And a lot of times it can be a humongo attitude and cause a lot of problems, right? The attitude here is just hostile, right? I was actually in a discussion, as of this filming, it was yesterday, and we're discussing very, very contentious topics, women's rights, all this stuff. And one individual said to this other individual, and I'm not even sure who was in the right, like there was behavior on both sides that was kind of dickish. And one individual said to the other one, shut up. And this person was like, no, you shut up. And this other person was like, fuck you. That was it. And I was like, right. I tried to stick around and talk to the person who said shut up and fuck you, and I should have cut sooner. I should have egressed sooner because the hostility was just like radical. And in that person's defense, it was super understandable why they were hostile. I might have even been in the wrong for addressing them in the way that I did. But that's on me for sure. And whether or not, whoever sort of was in the wrong, probably both parties, but maybe to a larger extent myself, the hostility from the other party was just like excessive, right? Ideally, so it's just an example of how things can go. And I'm sure you guys have seen your share of seeing disagreement and hostility on the internet is the easiest thing in the world. Ideally, you want to calm the waters and resume the argument. I've had a lot of success with this in the past using sort of lines like, hey, I'm just trying to learn, no hard feelings, please, right? I kind of had a line like that yesterday, and the argument was, fuck you, this isn't a forum for your learning. And it was like, well, holy shit. There's not much way to go after that, right? But a lot of times people will see that you're hostile, but just kind of misinterpret, or sorry, they'll be hostile, and they'll just kind of misinterpret you as mocking them or egging them on or being an adversary, and you just got to go, look, hey, I'm trying to learn, no hard feelings, seriously, right? And if they seem offended, or if they just say, like, well, you're really pissing me off, this is really offensive, you say, seriously, I never meant to offend, and I'm very sorry if I have. Or something to that extent, use your own words. But it should be sincere because you sincerely didn't mean to offend, right? We're trying to convince, not to offend, right? And if they express their views, no matter how belligerent or absurd those views are to you, you can say something like, I see where you're coming from and you have every right to those views. Notice, you are not admitting that they are correct. Just like earlier when we talked about a couple lectures ago, admitting that you see where someone's coming from is not remotely admitting that they are correct. Right? You can be debating Adolf Hitler himself and say, I see where you're coming from. He'd be like, what do you mean by that? Where am I coming from? Be like, well, you hate Jews and a bunch of other ethnic groups and you want all of them exterminated and you think the world will be a better place after, right? And he'll be like, yeah, right? Are you agreeing with that? Are you crazy? Of course not. Am I agreeing with that? I'm Jewish, for God's sake, right? Of course not. That's nonsense. It's a totally insane person. But seeing where someone's coming from is as easy as literally seeing where they're coming from. Like if a monster came to destroy the earth and you had an opportunity to talk to them, you could easily see it. I see where you're coming from. Maybe where am I coming from? You want to destroy the earth. You're like, oh, correct. You actually see where I'm coming from, right? That is not an admission of the fact that you agree with them. My God, no, of course not. But how does that make them feel to hear? And most people aren't Adolf Hitler, right? Actually, nobody except for Adolf Hitler is Adolf Hitler. Most people have pretty well-intentioned views. And even if you don't agree with them at all, you say, like, I see where you're coming from, right? And you have every right to those views. And they do. We live in a free society, thank God, not Adolf Hitler's society, right? So we live in a free society and they have every right to those views. And if you tell them that, they go, cool, okay. Yeah, so this person's clearly not out to get me because he sees where I'm coming from. He understands I have a right to my views. And then they might be interested in talking to you again. But sometimes not much progress can be made and you have to egress during such a mood. You might not be able to quell the mood. It might just be shitty. And everything you try to say, they're like, no, fuck you. No, fuck off. No, you're scum. This is no go. Then you have to egress. So what can you do? No matter the argument, no matter how shitty they are, you have to try to leave all arguments on a positive note every single time, right? Something like, it's been really great talking to you. If they're belligerent at the time of leaving, especially very belligerent, you can say, thanks for chatting and I wish you a great day, or I wish you the best. It's always good to wish people the best because you really do want the best for pretty much everyone, right? And it can be your version of the best. Let's say you are chatting with a white supremacist, like a real, actual KKK member, and you wish them the best at the end. Some people could say, why would you wish that person the best? Well, your version of the best is that they come to an understanding that their views are very hateful and very wrong and come to change their views and do better for the community and themselves. That's the best. You always want the best for everyone because that way everyone wins. So no matter how personal it got, no matter how awful it is, you can always say, hey, thanks for chatting because they did take their time to chat with you. And, I wish you a great day or wish you the best. And that's it. Right? And you can't be faulted for that kind of language. They can't be like, oh, you're a piece of shit for even saying that. Like, at that point, you're winning the argument in the views of the onlookers. Because if you're like, hey, sorry it went south. I wish you the best. See you later. Good luck with everything. And they're like, fuck you, die, right? And someone reads that and they're like, wow, one of those people clearly has a head on their shoulders and the other person's just losing, right? So, and to that point, it doesn't matter how pissed or not they are, right? To extend your chances of always convincing them later, right? Because after that, they might be thinking, oh God, I got so pissed that I told that person to go to hell. They reread the post by themselves like at 1 a.m. and they go, Jesus Christ, I was just such a dick. And I'm like actually super sorry. I'm not going to tell that person I'm sorry, but like, I really wish I had handled myself differently. And then they start reconsidering the issues. And if they don't do that, other onlookers will, right? So your best plan for those reasons is to always be thankful, always be polite, always. There's never a time I can conceive of where that's not a good idea, right? Sometimes, lastly, they may protest you leaving. They'd be like, oh, don't leave yet. Oh, yeah, you're running, pussy. Like, you can't fucking argue with me. I guess I won, right? Sometimes you can offer to take up the talk at a later date because you're leaving. You could be like, hey, and if you're not going to come back, just say that. Be like, hey, I think I got some other stuff going on. It's been really good. And if they say, hey, oh yeah, you're running away, you can choose to respond to that or not. You don't have to respond to that. If your last response was good and was an egress, that's good enough. But you could be like, no, I'm not running away. I'm just, I just got other stuff going on. But I think it's honestly like, thank you so much for your time and I wish you the best, right? It turns really third grade if they keep pursuing like, oh yeah, you're running away. Like, it just makes them look bad. You kind of hope they say that because it makes your argument look better, right? And if you really, do want to come back, then you want to be like, hey, maybe we should talk about this later. Or when, let me comment on this later. Or when can you chat again, right? When you do that, it doesn't look like you're running away, and you're not. And that's how egress works. Right? And remember, the only way it can be true that you're running away, because when you're done talking to someone and you just don't want to try to convince them anymore, you're never running away. You're just like, oh, we're done here. Like, I can't seem to convince you. If they have made good points that you haven't addressed and you haven't accepted that they're great points, and then you egress, that could look like you're running away, and you very much are. Don't do that. Remember, one of our big rules is admit all of the good points that they made. So it could look like they made some really good points, and then you have to go, even if you don't have time to make your own good points, you just have to call that a learning experience. And I mean that literally, like you learn some good points, and then come back whenever you want, or just talk to someone else later, right? Huge overarching theme here. When you egress, do it with care for that person's attitude for the future, for them considering this stuff differently, and for onlookers, and for your own sanity, because you really are a good person, you really do care, and you really do wish everyone, including people who disagree with you, the very best. That sounds good. Folks, see you next time for the lectures on the shortened versions of these discussions when the long form version is just not tenable. See you then.